August 14th, 1944. The moon hung like a blood-streaked eye in the sky as a jeep full of Allied resistance fighters rumbled over the uneven terrain. They'd been sent to investigate an old Nazi prison camp, one that had been scrubbed from all official records. The camp, known only by a few as Geisterlager, the ghost camp, was rumored to be the site of unspeakable atrocities, a place that even the Nazis feared to speak about. It had been abandoned months earlier, but whispers of horrific experiments and mass executions echoed through the nearby villages. Lieutenant James Donovan, an American officer leading the team, glanced at the dilapidated map in his hands. The ink was faded, and the camp was marked only by a vague black X in the forest near the Czech border. Beside him sat Father Anton, a local priest who had been roped into the mission because of his knowledge of the occult. Anton was pale and silent, his hands trembling slightly as they neared the camp. No one knew why they needed a priest on a reconnaissance mission, but the higher-ups had insisted. "Are we getting close?" Private Henderson asked from the back seat, his voice barely rising above the hum of the engine. Donovan nodded. "Another mile, maybe less." They descended into a hollow, and the trees grew denser, their branches intertwining like skeletal hands overhead. As they neared the camp, the jeep's headlights fell on the rusted remains of a barbed wire fence. The gate stood ajar, its iron hinges corroded, but the German words painted across the top remained legible. "Arbeit macht frei." Work sets you free. The jeep ground to a halt. Donovan stepped out, scanning the area. No sound came from within the camp except for the low moan of the wind. It was eerie, far too quiet for a place that once housed hundreds of prisoners. "Stay sharp," Donovan ordered, gripping his rifle. The others followed him through the gate, their boots crunching on gravel. Behind them, the towering watchtowers loomed, casting long shadows in the moonlight. The buildings, once barracks, were now little more than skeletons of their former selves. Windows shattered, doors hanging off their hinges, walls scorched black from fire. Yet something about the place felt alive, as if it were breathing. Henderson shuddered and muttered under his breath, "This place is cursed. I can feel it." Father Anton made the sign of the cross. "There are things here, things that cannot be undone." The group continued deeper into the camp, their footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. Every step seemed to carry them further from the outside world, deeper into a place where time had no meaning. As they passed the empty cells, they began to feel a presence. It was subtle at first, a tingling at the back of their necks, a cold breath that prickled their skin. Then they heard it. A faint, ghostly wail drifted through the air, so soft it was almost indistinguishable from the wind. But it wasn't the wind. It was a cry, long, mournful, and filled with suffering. The group froze, glancing at each other with wide eyes. "Did you hear that?" Private Stevens whispered, his face pale. Donovan nodded, his grip tightening on his rifle. "Keep moving. We're almost to the main building." The main building was larger than the others, its walls reinforced and its doors thick steel. It had once housed the prison's command center in the interrogation rooms. Now it stood as a monolith of horror. As they entered, the temperature dropped instantly. Their breath came out in misty puffs, and the stench of death hit them like a physical force. Rotting flesh, burned hair, and something else. Something unholy. They descended into the lower levels, their flashlights cutting through the suffocating darkness. The deeper they went, the stronger the feeling of being watched became. Donovan could hear the faint scratching of nails on the stone walls, but whenever he turned, there was nothing. "This isn't right," Father Anton whispered. "This place is wrong." Suddenly, they came to a set of doors, heavy with rust and engraved with strange symbols. Donovan hesitated before pushing them open, revealing a chamber unlike any they had seen before. The walls were lined with occult symbols, crudely drawn in blood, and the floor was covered with a massive circular sigil. At the center of the room was an altar, stained dark from decades of use. Henderson gagged, covering his mouth. What is this?" Father Anton stepped forward, his voice shaking. "This is not a prison. This is a place of sacrifice." Before anyone could respond, a low growl rumbled from the far side of the room. The flashlights flickered, and then from the shadows a figure emerged. It was twisted and deformed, its body a mass of contorted limbs and flesh. Its face, though barely human, was filled with anguish, as if it had been frozen in a state of eternal suffering. The soldiers backed away, but Donovan held his ground, his heart pounding in his chest. What the hell is that?" Father Anton spoke, his voice trembling. "It is one of them, the prisoners. They weren't just killed, they were transformed, their souls bound to this place through dark rituals." The creature lunged, moving with unnatural speed. Donovan fired, the sound of his gunshot deafening in the small room. The bullet ripped through the thing's chest, but it didn't stop. It kept coming, faster, stronger. Stephen screamed, and in the chaos, the creature grabbed him, dragging him toward the altar. His cries echoed through the chamber as the others fired wildly, their bullets doing nothing to stop it. As Stephen's screams turned into gurgles, Father Anton dropped to his knees, muttering prayers under his breath. "We need to leave, now!" But it was too late. The sigil on the floor began to glow, casting an eerie red light throughout the room. From the walls, the shadows began to take form, dozens of them, all twisted like the creature, all moving toward the group. Donovan felt the weight of terror crushing down on him. "Retreat! Everyone, fall back!" But as they turned to flee, the door slammed shut with a thunderous bang, trapping them inside. The heavy iron door slammed shut with a force that reverberated through the chamber, sealing them inside. Panic set in immediately. Private Stephen's screams had faded, replaced by a sickening silence that gnawed at the remaining soldiers. The walls of the room seemed to close in, vibrating with a low hum, as if the prison itself was alive and hungry. Lieutenant Donovan rushed to the door, slamming his shoulder into it, but it didn't budge. His heart hammered in his chest as he felt the cold breath of fear creeping into his bones. "Open it! Help me!" Donovan shouted, but deep down he knew. There was no escaping this place, not without confronting whatever nightmare had been unleashed. Father Anton stood motionless, muttering prayers under his breath as if they might shield him from the horrors that now surrounded them. But even he seemed to know it was futile. Henderson backed into a corner, his rifle raised, eyes wide with terror. "This isn't real. This can't be real," he muttered to himself, barely coherent. But it was real, and it was only just beginning. From the shadows, more figures began to emerge, their grotesque forms barely human. Some were little more than charred remnants of bodies, twisted and blackened as if burned alive. Others had faces contorted in eternal screams, skin peeled back from their skulls. These were the prisoners, the souls of the tortured, fused with dark forces beyond the soldiers' understanding. "They were used," Father Anton whispered, his voice filled with dread. "These men were more than just victims. They were experiments, sacrifices to something ancient, something that should have stayed buried." The glowing sigil on the floor pulsed with malevolent energy, the blood-red light casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. The spirits moved slowly at first, as if testing their new forms. But as they approached, their pace quickened, driven by an insatiable hunger. Donovan snapped out of his terror and barked orders. "Get ready! If these things are coming for us, we fight." But deep inside, he knew bullets wouldn't stop them. Father Anton stepped forward, gripping the small crucifix around his neck. His voice shook, but he began chanting, drawing from his knowledge of exorcisms and old rites. "In the name of God, I command you to—" A guttural roar interrupted him, and one of the twisted spirits leaped forward, crashing into the priest with inhuman speed. It slammed him to the ground, its skeletal fingers digging into his flesh. Anton screamed, his prayers turning to cries of agony. Donovan fired again, but the bullets passed straight through the creature. It didn't flinch. Henderson was losing it. "We can't fight them! We can't kill them!" But Donovan didn't listen. He refused to believe they were already dead. Not like this. Then in the far corner of the room, something shifted. A low growl echoed from the shadows, a deeper, more guttural sound than the others. From the darkness emerged a figure unlike the others. It was taller, more defined, almost human, but its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, burning with hatred. The creature's gaze locked onto Donovan, and a cold dread swept over him. This was no mere spirit. This was the source of the evil in the camp, the entity that had corrupted the souls of the prisoners. "It's him," Father Anton gasped, still writhing on the floor. "The commandant, the one who led the experiments. He's still here, bound to this place." Donovan stood frozen, staring at the figure. It wore a tattered Nazi uniform, its skin pale and rotting, but its eyes, those eyes were alive, filled with malice and hunger. Without warning, the commandant lunged, faster than any of the other spirits. It grabbed Henderson by the throat, lifting him off the ground with a single hand. Henderson kicked and struggled, but it was useless. The commandant's grip was like iron. "No!" Donovan screamed, raising his rifle and firing. But just like before, the bullets did nothing. Henderson's body convulsed, and then, with a sickening crack, his neck snapped. The commandant tossed his lifeless body aside like a rag doll, its glowing eyes now focused on Donovan. This was it, Donovan realized. There was no fighting this thing, no stopping it. But then Father Anton's voice rose again, louder this time, filled with a desperate strength. He was reciting something in Latin, words Donovan didn't understand, but the effect was immediate. The spirits around them recoiled, their movements slowing, as if the words were weakening them. The commandant snarled, stepping back, its eyes narrowing in hatred. For a moment, Donovan saw an opportunity. "We need to destroy the altar," Father Anton gasped, his voice strained. "It's the source, the power binding them here." Donovan turned to the altar in the center of the room, its surface slick with old blood. It was covered in symbols, the same occult markings they'd seen throughout the camp. Without hesitating, he sprinted toward it, grabbing the heaviest object he could find, a rusted iron rod, and brought it down with all his strength. The altar cracked, and as it did, the sigil on the floor began to dim, its glow fading. The spirits howled, their forms flickering and distorting as the energy that held them began to unravel. The commandant roared in fury, but it was too late. The hold this place had on the dead was breaking. With one final blow, Donovan smashed the altar to pieces. The chamber erupted in a blinding light, and for a moment, everything was still. Silent. When the light faded, Donovan stood alone in the room. The spirits, the twisted creatures, even the commandant, they were gone. The oppressive weight of the camp lifted, replaced by an eerie calm. Father Anton lay on the floor, barely alive, his face pale and streaked with blood. Donovan rushed to his side, lifting him gently. "It's over," Donovan whispered, though he wasn't entirely sure. Anton's eyes fluttered open, and he gave a weak nod. "For now, but the evil here, it will never fully die." Donovan helped Anton to his feet, and together they made their way toward the exit. The door that had trapped them was now wide open, as if the camp itself was letting them go. Outside, the moon still hung low in the sky, but the air felt lighter. The war raged on beyond the trees, but in that moment, Donovan knew they had faced something far worse than any battlefield. As they left the cursed grounds of Geisterlager behind, Donovan couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't truly escaped. Not completely. Some horrors, he realized, were too deep, too ancient to ever truly end. And as the wind howled through the trees, he could have sworn he heard the faint echo of footsteps behind him, reminding him that some evils linger in the shadows, waiting.